So last fall, Target sent out a notice that a lot of the credit card information that was recorded in the store itself, so this is not their online purchases, but in their stores, the credit card transactions had been compromised. In other words, somebody had gained access to a lot of credit card information, including credit card numbers. Now, Target, you would think would have an incredible resources for protecting this information. And they do. They do spend an inordinate amount of money trying to protect this credit card information because they know it's very important to keep a very positive relationship with its customers. And yet, here is a case where their protections were not enough. Now, what did this mean? What was the cost to Target? Well, for one, they lost a lot of trust from their customers. But two, in order to work with their customers, they offered to give them access to for credit history scores. They would pay for it so that you could check your credit over the next year for free to make sure that if you had been one of the compromised accounts, you could have it fixed. So information security management is kind of the topic for today, and it is still a huge, huge issue in a lot of organizations. So what we want to talk about today is, number one, talk about the goal of information systems security. But then there's a whole variety of topics. And in fact, I could probably sit here and talk for hours and hours and hours about it. So I'm really going to have to cut back quite a bit on this subject. But we want to talk about how big this problem is, how you should respond to security threats, you as an individual, and then also how should organizations respond to security threats. Then talk about different technological safeguards, data safeguards, human safeguards, and how should organizations respond to security incidents, like specific incidents. And then lastly, I'm going to actually dig into some things that are not covered in the book that should have been. Because this subject is so huge and it's so important for you to understand that, in fact, usually I will spend 2 or 3 days just lecturing on this. So I'm really going to try to cram it in. There is that much security. Well, and let me rephrase that. I could spend an entire semester talking about this stuff. It's that huge. All right. So let's start with definitions. So what are the major elements of IS security? Well, first is the threat. There's a threat that a person or organization could obtain data or other assets illegally without the owner's permission and often without the owner's knowledge. So this threat exists out there. There are people who want this data. Now, obviously, what the problem is that there's also vulnerabilities that go with these threats. So there's people that want it, and there's ways that they can get it. These are opportunities. So a vulnerability is an opportunity for threats to gain access to an individual or organizational assets. For example, you go to Target, you swipe your credit card. Now Target has your credit card data. So if you buy something online, not only does the company that you purchased the information from or purchased the product from have your credit card data, but that credit card information has to pass over the internet, which passes over lots and lots of devices, physical devices, to get there. So it passes through a lot of different companies. Now, ideally, all this is secure, but you may not know 100% sure that it is secure. Right? So that's where safeguards come in. So we know there's vulnerabilities. Safeguards are built to try to block or protect these vulnerabilities. Right? So block access to these assets. And last thing, the last major element is the target, which is the asset desired by the threat. Right? So you have a threat, they're going to target something when there's a vulnerability and no safeguard to protect it. So what is the goal of information system security? Well, it's to make a trade-off between these vulnerabilities and safeguards and targets and threats, because you can't block everything. It's simply too expensive, right? So you have to kind of judge what are the biggest risks, the biggest vulnerabilities, and let's block it at the cheapest price because we don't have infinite sums of money. So that minimize the amount of loss. And I'm using a lot of subjective terms here, and you might be wondering, well, why can't you just say, we're not going to allow anybody access to this data? Well, because you can't do it. It's simply too expensive to say, well, we're going to collect data on credit card numbers, right? Well, you need to do that in order to process that information. But how do you process that information? You need other people to have access to it. It might be internal to the organization. But if they have access internally, then what happens if an intruder breaks into the internal network? Now they have access as well. So you have to really think hard about this. And really all you're talking about is a bunch of bits on computers, ones and zeros. That's all it is. And the safeguards are usually ones and zeros. So why can't you just rewrite the ones and zeros to get access and to get that information and send it back out? If that's all it is. So, when it comes down to these, you have these threats from persons, organizations, you have these vulnerabilities, you have these safeguards and the target, but you have to figure out how best to protect our assets with the resources that we have. Now, these losses, the source of these threats, so the source of threats can actually come from multiple different areas, including just human error. Right? Yes, that needs to be included in this. Human error is a threat to your data. It can and has caused serious problems. You can have threats from computer crime. These are people usually, but not always, outside of the organization. And there's threat from natural disasters, so things that you may not have control over. And is not, in fact, not even related to a person, but they're still a threat to your information system security. And what type of losses can there be? Well, you can have unauthorized data disclosure, meaning your data gets out there, like the credit card numbers, right? Unauthorized data disclosure. Or you can have incorrect data modification, meaning that the data is being changed within your organization so that it is wrong. And that, trust me, that's not good. That can cause major problems. You can have faulty service. So where your service simply is not, and it may not necessarily break, but it could just be, it doesn't behave correctly. You can also just be denied your service. Right? And this may not be, we're not necessarily talking about someone who's blocking you from getting into something, but it could just be that you can't get to a current website at this point in time. I get that a lot. Or you can even have a loss of infrastructure. Right? So between these threats and these losses, there's a lot of different issues we can talk about here. And we can't cover all of these. It's simply too overwhelming. In fact, we're going to spend most of our time talking about the computer crime, simply because the human error, while it's important, whether it's an employee misunderstands their procedures or accidentally deletes records, employees can inadvertently install an old database over a current one. So there's a lot of human error that could occur here, but that's not really what people talk about most, even though human error is very important to not do, and can be very costly. The one that gets the most glamour is the threats, and glamour is probably not the right word, but the most discussion. are the people who try to break into systems and do damage. So what types of security loss exist? Well, unauthorized data disclosure, can include things like phishing or spoofing. Now, you may not be familiar with these terms before. So essentially, phishing would be when you receive an email that looks like it may have come from a legitimate source, but it really didn't. And inside that email might say, click on this link to reset your email or to reset your password, right? So what they do is they try to make an email look professional, look legitimate, but actually takes you to a third-party website. And when you type in your password, they store it and capture it, and then they use it later for other nefarious purposes. Right? Spoofing is a similar way, is a similar concept, where you try to pretend to be something that you're not. There's something called sniffers. So a sniffer, and you think about a dog sniffer, right? It's constantly trying to find that right smell that it's looking for, right? Think of a bloodhound sniffing for a trail and tracking them, right? Well, sniffer's is kind of the same way. It sits there and watches data flowing by, looking for specific patterns. And when it finds that pattern, it suddenly says beep, beep, and it notifies it that there's something here that they want to look in more detail at. And so then the sniffer might be looking for keywords like password. And when they see the term password, they look to see what's immediately following it, because maybe someone actually wrote a password, and it can capture that. And then you have people that hacking, and I don't want to go into too much of the details of what hacking actually entails, but it's the ability to break into gain access to company resources and be able to, through various different means, but lots of it's programming and knowing how to find passwords and to gain access to that. So, and even natural disasters can cause unauthorized data disclosure. So, for example, there might be a glitch in the power which pulls down the firewall protecting a database, right? That would be a natural disaster, maybe a small form of it, but it's still there. You can have incorrect data modification, right? Which leads to, how do you change the address, or how do you change an employee's salary? Maybe a customer, or does a customer get a discount? Or placing incorrect data on a company website. So maybe it's the incorrect price for a product. So there needs to be some sort of controls on how data is modified. You can have faulty service. So problems caused by incorrect system operation, including, again, data modification, but also, is the system working incorrectly? Are there procedural mistakes, programming errors, IT installation errors? There is even something called usurpation, which occurs when computer criminals invade a computer system and replace legitimate programs for illegitimate programs. Basically allows them to spy. And in the process, gain all kinds of data that you may not want them to gain access to. Now, also included in this might be something called denial of service. Now, a denial of service just basically means you're not able to reach the service that you're trying to get to. So sometimes this happens when you type in a website name, a domain name into the URL, and you hit enter, and it tells you, it's not available, right? Now, this could be that your internet service is down. It could be that it's blocked by a firewall. And so they might be not necessarily intentional. There could be, denying service could be unintentional. What a denial of service attack is an intentional process of bringing down some sort of computing system. Now, usually this is done by computer criminals who are unhappy with the service of some other company. And so generally they focus on companies, whether it's their website or some other system within the company. But their goal is to make it unavailable through a various different techniques. Now, one of these techniques is called the distributive denial of service attacks. And probably one of the ones that get the most publication nowadays essentially involves a computer criminal who gains access to hundreds, if not thousands, of computers unknown to these people. And sometimes they gain access but don't do anything until a specified time. And at that time, they'll suddenly start sending out thousands of messages every second to this one central location, the computer they're trying to attack. And in that attack, these thousands of messages from thousands of computers overwhelm this central location, the central computer, so that the central computer simply cannot handle all of the requests that are being sent to it, and essentially makes it unfunctional. Now, this is what's called the distributive denial of service, because the service goes down because it's receiving so many requests it simply can't handle it. So when you hear about web something, and that doesn't happen as much as it used to, but big companies, particularly back in the 90s and early 2000s, would be vulnerable to this, especially like their website, if suddenly they had these millions of requests hitting it all at the same time and it couldn't handle it. And so it kind of looks something like this, where the hacker computer would create what they call these zombie machines. And the zombie machines were spread across all over the place. So it could be, from university computers, home computers, government computers, different business computers. But these, when the hacker sent the signal, or maybe set a date, and a little program, the program then and all these other computers would all attack this target system. And it could bring it down to where it's not functional. All right, you can also have problems with the loss of infrastructure. And it could just be something like a bulldozer is cutting digging in the ground and accidentally cuts a fiber optic cable. Or it could be something like a flood on the basement of your IT center. And the flood, cuts out all the power. But it can also be theft or terrorist events, cyber warfare. Could also create problems where we have, and for example, this actually happened recently with Iran. And now I don't remember who exactly initiated this attack, but there was something called Stuxnet and Flame that was reputed to have set back the Iranian nuclear program by causing their computers to malfunction. Now, you can also have problems with disgruntled or terminated employees, and we'll talk a little bit about how to deal with that. But if someone gets laid off from their job, they might be kind of ticked off. And if you don't have a policy for how they are, an information policy for how they're leaving the organization, they could do some damage before they leave. They might to say, well, I'm going to delete the database. And this can be particularly troublesome for an IT worker. An IT worker who gets fired and is ticked off has access, a password to the database, and he just clicks delete, and then deletes all the backups real quick, and then walks out the door. Said, I'm fired. I don't care. screw them. So I mean that can be huge, or they might just cause just havoc with the systems before they leave. So this is huge, right? This is obviously a major problem. How big is it? Well, I mean, we're talking at over $400 billion a year in computer crime. It is that big. And, just here's a smattering of events in 2011. So, credit cards that are being stolen and used to purchase goods. There's denial of service attacks on PayPal. Former employees that steal coworkers' email credentials, fraudulent sales of non-existent items, spoofing of IRS tax preparation services, so people pay them to do their taxes, but it doesn't get done. Different types of software that steals credit card data. Over and over and over again, this keeps occurring. Now, just recently, this past spring, there was a huge security breach in secure website transactions called SSL. It was called the heartbeat bug. The heartbeat bug. That basically it was 2/3 of all websites use this particular type of security for accessing secure information. 2/3 of websites. And the bug was so massive that they basically said everyone needs to go out and change their passwords after these companies fix the bug. I mean, if you change the password before they fix the bug, they still have access to your password, so they wouldn't really do a whole lot of good. But 2/3 of all websites were extremely vulnerable. Right, and so this costs, and this was human error. This was not but it was a human error in the construction of the security, which left the possibility for someone. So it created a vulnerability, right? The safeguard was not safe. It left a huge vulnerability that many different computer criminals could have taken advantage of. So it continues to be a huge issue. And these security attacks come from all over, right? So attacks on information, computer resources can come. But here's an important part. It doesn't have to come from outside the company. Although that usually gets the most publicity, most companies don't want to talk about inside attacks. That's not something that you really want to publicize, and very rarely do. So yes, huge damage. Computer sabotage costs, about $10 billion a year. I might have said $400 billion. I think that's. I'm sorry. I'm jumping ahead of myself. That's a different thing, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second. Computer sabotage costs roughly $10 billion per year, but in general, employee misconduct is more costly than assaults from outside. And that means you're going to be employees, right? Now, and most of you will be awesome employees, and this will never be an issue. But do realize that every now and then there's going to be those employees within a company who do behave badly, right? So how bad is this? All right. So statistics on white-collar crime. And now, so this is the internal threat problem, right? This is where the $400 billion comes in. This is white-collar crime, and it doesn't necessarily have to be computer-based, although sometimes it is. But, and I'm not just talking about, little theft of, an employee who steals a shirt from the retail store where they're working, right? They can do that, and it's not good, but, that's the small-scale stuff. What's a bigger issue is something called embezzlement. So embezzlement is basically this idea where as part of your job, you have access to some assets, So this could be physical assets or even money, right? So you can think of a cashier. As they're checking people out, they have cash in their hand, right? They're supposed to put that cash, so they're responsible for that cash. They're supposed to put the cash in the cash register and keep a running log of every purchase that they make. Well, so embezzlement would be like if they, didn't charge the customer what they said they charged, so there's a difference in money, or if the employee actually took some of the money out of the cash register and took it home with them. So that's embezzlement. And so and usually embezzlement is done in small increments, but done over a long time. And this is kind of typical of how, so they do it in small increments, so it's less likely to be detected. But if you do this over a long period of time, you can actually accumulate quite a bit. And so the average non-managerial investment is estimated to be around $60,000. Now, part of this is, like I said, it is estimated because 2/3 of insider fraud simply isn't reported, or at least that's the estimate, right? Managers, however, as you might imagine, have access to a lot more things and can usually, when they embezzle, it's much more rare, but when they do embezzle, they do it for a lot more. And sometimes the managers will actually recruit their employees to help with the embezzlement and then split the money between them. And so this is a major issue. Internal threats, and this is particularly important when you're talking about information. Information, like you said, data is extremely valuable to businesses, right? So the internal threat to that data is much bigger than it is the external threat. And we'll get into a little bit about how organizations can help manage that. But let's turn back to some of the different types of attacks that are experienced. So, for example, the green line kind of shows the insider abuse of net access and email. That's actually not the, not, how best can I say that? It's not where you're stealing stuff. It's just when you're misusing resources. All right, so the big things are malware infections. And this happens a lot and continues to be done a lot. And we'll talk a little bit about what you can do to help avoid that. But there's also, insider abuse of how you're using the internet or email. Basically, you're using company resources and time to basically sit on the internet and not do your job, right? And so there might be some difference of opinion of how much is too much or too little, but the fact of the matter is, and so that abuse might be small, but then again, sometimes there's an argument to be made that some relaxation of the use of internet can actually help productivity, but that's a whole nother discussion that we're not even going to get into today. Things that happen a little bit more rarely would be things like financial fraud, using password sniffers, exploiting wireless networks. And they're still important to be aware of and to guard against. However, they're not the big things that often happen. So how do you know when you're being attacked? So we see that there's this huge problem. Well, what you want to try to do is detect it using, hopefully, an automated system. So that's where the idea of an intrusion detection system comes from. And most businesses have something like this set up. So it's a computer program that senses when another computer is attempting to scan, disk, or otherwise access a computer. And so here's a quote from an IT professional, IT administrator, that says, "When I run an IDS on a computer on a public internet, I get more than 1,000 attempts, mostly from foreign countries. There's nothing you can do about it except use reasonable safeguards." In other words, there's constantly people scanning computer networks looking for vulnerabilities. That's what they're doing. So supposing, there's a computer patch that has been released, but a lot of businesses don't patch their computers immediately. This gives these computer criminals a chance to scan to see, have you fixed it or not? If you haven't fixed it, they may try to access your system with this bug that hasn't been fixed yet. Excuse me. All right, so how should you respond to these security threats? Right? Well, number one is just take it very seriously. Security is a major problem. And while we want to be very trusting at times, we want to trust other people. That's part of who we are as humans, right? We want to develop relationships with these people. However, you have to know when to trust and when not to trust, and basically say, make people pass a certain bar before you trust them, especially when it comes to information security. Now, one thing you can also do is to help with that is to create strong passwords. Now, I could sit here and talk probably for 10, 20 minutes about how to do this. Essentially what it means, and you've probably seen a lot of businesses are doing this, like even at ECU, and I just got an email recently that says it's time to update your password. Well, in order for me to update my password, I have to have certain features in it, including, a different, you have to have alpha characters, numbers, and special characters, and they recommend I put some capital letters in there too. So by mixing it up, all the different character combinations, it makes my password stronger. And by making it stronger, it makes it less likely somebody can can guess it, basically. You don't want people to guess your password. And you don't want people to use a computer that can try different passwords. Right? So, for example, I could use a dictionary and take every term out of the dictionary and try it as a password. So if, let's say, somebody uses a password using the word monkey, right? Well, guess what? My computer can guess that in seconds, right? Because it can scan through and try all these different dictionary terms and plug it in. It also can be helpful to use multiple passwords. Now, this can also be a double-edged sword, and this actually happens to my mother-in-law all the time. She uses multiple passwords and then forgets them. She sometimes writes them down, but she writes them down in different places. So she has like 10 different locations of passwords that are just everywhere, and she can't keep track of which password goes where. And it doesn't help that she doesn't have a real good grasp of how computers work. So she'll say things like, well, my computer password, well, what she's really referring to is her password to access the internet. And then there might be a password to access her Suddenlink account. But she doesn't know the difference between a Suddenlink account and the password that goes on that versus the router or the modem or the router that she uses in her house for her wireless account. There's a different password, but she doesn't know that those are two different things. And so there's a lot of confusion in the terminology when she even talks about what password to use where. So multiple passwords can be very good, but you have to keep very good tabs on what passwords you have, what accounts they go to, and how you store these passwords. Now, there's a good question in the discussion forum about, and I need to reply to that still, but there's a question in the discussion forum about, passwords and how do you use them, or should you, let me rephrase this, do I trust saving passwords in a cloud environment? And my basic response is probably not, but I don't know enough about their security to say yes or no. And generally, if you're having multiple passwords, you want to try to keep them in some centralized location, but you also want to keep that centralized location secure itself. So there's a lot of ifs that can go into this. Other things you should be aware of. Don't send valuable data via email or instant message, right? In fact, there are, some organizations actually have very strict rules about that, about what can be sent over email. When you go to make a purchase online, make sure there's an HTTPS in the domain or in the URL, which signifies that it is secure. Also, that S means that it has to be, means that it's been certified, or you should check to make sure that it's certified, that the company is legit, that it's a reputable vendor, and they have a certificate program where you can get certificates proving that you are reputable. Other things, make sure you update your antivirus software, demonstrate security concern to your fellow workers so that they don't give away information. And consider security for all business initiatives. Right? So security should be something built into what you're doing. What about organizations? How should they respond to security threats? Well, number one is that they should develop a company-wide security policy. They need to know what sensitive data they have and where to store it, and store it in such a way that it will be protected. They need to decide how to process that data. So not only the storage of it, but when you're processing it, will that processing make it vulnerable? Right? And can you put some safeguards on that? You need to decide, will the data be shared and with whom? And while the book says with organizations, but also with what employees, which employees will have access to what data? That should be well spelled out, including how employees and others can obtain copies of the data stored about them. Need to have make it clear how employees and others can request changes if there's inaccurate data. You need to have a policy on what employees can do with their own mobile devices at work. In fact, some places will say you cannot bring a mobile device to work, or you cannot access our network. Whereas there's other places that are like, yeah, well, that's fine. Like here at ECU, we have a policy that says, students need to bring their own laptops and this is within the College of Business, but students are required to bring their own laptops to class. So in this case, we do encourage you to bring your own mobile devices to work, right? But some places, especially when there's a high security, you don't want them, let's say, to bring their tablet, their iPad, or their smartphone into the office and then connect to the Wi-Fi network, simply because you can't control the security on those devices. You also might have problems, and I've heard about that, especially in the government, in the Department of Defense. They require, they'll basically say that no, you can't access sites like Gmail or Yahoo Mail. You can't access personal email at work. You can only use work email. So they have control over the email that comes in and out. All right, so safeguards, though, need to relate to the 5 IS components. We need technical safeguards, data safeguards, and even human safeguards. So let's talk about all of these. How can technical safeguards protect against security threats? And it starts with, identification and authentication. And this is simple, a password to log into a system. You can also include encryption. And so a lot of times if you're going to a e-commerce site, you have to have things encrypted so that, basically that plain text isn't readable along the path to the other end. So the data gets mixed up, and there's keys for interpreting it at each end that help describe what's in the data packet that's being sent, but anyone viewing it along the way just sees a bunch of gibberish. Firewalls are very common. Now, if you have your own personal Wi-Fi network at home, oftentimes that router comes with a built-in firewall in it. And it's a very simple one. Well, organizations are going to have a much more sophisticated firewall, and sometimes multiple firewalls that protect the internal computers from the outside internet. You need some sort of malware protection for, spyware or adware, viruses, and there's software, and I have some on my computer, both here at home and at work, to help protect against that. And do be sure that that's updated normally, because there's new spyware, new adware that keeps being created. And you also need to design your new software for secure applications, to be secure from the ground up. So build security into your applications. Now, a little bit more about online security. So the essence of HTTPS, or something called, which uses something called SSL, Secure Sockets Layer, which is the older version. Now it's TLS, which I'm going to butcher it if I try to remember the acronym. TLS. I believe the last S is security. But at any rate, so the point being, even if you don't know what this acronym stands for, essentially what happens when you're going to a website. So let's say you want to purchase something from Amazon.com. And you want to put your credit card information. They need it in order to make the purchase happen, right? But you want to make sure that the information that you type into your computer, as it passes through all these other computing systems to get to the Amazon website, so it has to pass through a lot of different devices that are owned not by you and not by Amazon. And the whole HTTPS system is designed to do this. So what Amazon does is they have something called a public key, and they send that to you. And then you, at your end, you can see that key, but then you want to, and it's kind of complex how this all works, all the details, but essentially you also have your own key. So you use Amazon's public key to send back your public key, so that Amazon knows, can start a communication back and forth using a doubly secure transmission. So now we're getting a little bit more complex here. But how do you know that Amazon is legit? Well, or let's say you're not going to Amazon, maybe it's a newer website. How do you know they're legit? Well, they actually have a way of certifying that this website actually is reputable. And so there's a whole system here built around this for protecting your information when you do this. And if you don't, so you suppose you're on your browser and you get this notice that their certificate is no longer valid. Basically, that just means they haven't updated their certification. Should you trust that website? Maybe. I don't know. That's up to you. But the entire public-private key infrastructure, which is what SSL and TLS is built upon, is designed to encrypt information that's being sent between you and another website. That's the essence of it all. All right. What about firewalls? Well, firewalls are really designed to prevent information from getting in and sometimes information from getting out. Now, the firewall, so what is a firewall? We can kind of think of it, the term actually comes from a building that has a wall built into it that won't let fire from one part of the building go to another part of the building. So it's specifically designed to prevent the spread of fire. The idea was a similar concept when it came to networks, in that we wanted to build a wall essentially that prevents certain data from moving from one side to the other of that wall. Now, generally speaking, the major concern is information coming in from the outside that we don't want to, particularly people that are trying to hack into your computer systems. And so there's oftentimes one or many times even two firewalls, sometimes even more. So there might be a public web server, and that web server has to connect to the internet in order to enable website, so people from the outside to access your website, to your company's website. But you don't want a hacker to be able to come into your web server and change the web pages, right? So you need to have some block. And a perimeter firewall can do that. Now, internal, so these personal computers, so the computers that you might be using, also need to access the internet. So you need some ability to get out to the internet and look at a website and bring that website data back to your personal computer, right? So you're going out to this external computer and you're bringing back some files. So you do want to have some stuff that can get in, but you don't want everything to get in. And so that's why you have an additional internal firewall that's much more secure. And essentially what happens in these firewalls is that they are filtering out ones and zeros that don't belong. So the bits and bytes from other locations that are trying to gain access that you don't want to gain access. What other kind of problems are there? Well, we can also have malware types and spyware and adware. And man, the number of these things just keep growing, and the variations, Trojan horses and worms, the payload of a virus and beacons that are used. And I could, again, spend hours talking about all these possible ways that software can be created that screws up your computer. It slows down system startup or makes it sluggish. Sometimes they do pop-up advertisements. That's what Adware is, that you can't control. Those suddenly pop up an advertisement. So they're getting paid for the advertisement, and you're stuck having to look at it even though you don't want to. There might be changes to your home page or suspicious changes to a taskbar on your browser, or unusual hard disk activity. So there's all kinds of things that could happen with these. Now, we can protect against that using antivirus software or anti-spyware programs. Make sure you scan frequently. You can update your malware definitions. And here's an important one. Open email attachments only from known sources. So back in, I think it was 1999, there was the I love you bug. Or maybe it was early 2000. So the I love you bug was essentially a little piece of software that attached to email. And it worked on Microsoft Outlook email accounts. So people that had Microsoft Outlook, if they opened this email, it would automatically run this little script that would scan all the contacts in your Outlook account. It would then send an email to each one of those contacts with this same little program in it as an attachment. And the subject line said, I love you. Well, as you can imagine, a lot of people got emails from contacts, probably contacts that people that they knew. And so when the subject line said, I love you, people were like, oh, what the heck's this? And so they opened it out of curiosity. It brought down thousands of computer networks. The volume of emails that were sent over a 2-day period was astronomical and literally caused millions of dollars in damage because companies had to shut down basically their email servers. They were overloaded with emails because everyone kept opening this email that said, I love you. So yes, it can, and it was an attachment. So people were opening it without really knowing what was in it. And so that's a major, major problem. So be sure you update your software. Browse only reputable internet neighborhoods, because if you go to nefarious sites, guess what? They're going to try to find ways to convince you to download software that you probably shouldn't be and put it on your computer. You can also design for secure applications, and then probably a little bit more obscure, but still a very dangerous type of attack is called an SQL injection attack. So we talked about our database. We created a database in this class, and while we didn't really learn SQL, you probably have heard the term. Well, there is a way, particularly on websites, where you can use a technique for adding data or database commands using web forms. And it's a sophisticated attack, but can really screw with the data within a company's database. All right? So you have to design your applications to avoid these types of attacks. So you have to have good, secure design from the ground up. So question 6, how can data safeguards protect against security threats? Well, number one, you need to define data policies. What are the policies for the company, for our data? How are we going to protect it? Who has rights? Who has responsibilities over this data? So rights can be enforced by user accounts, like things like authenticated passwords. And so there's an entire, and we'll talk a bit about this in the human safeguards section, but you can prevent people from having access to data simply by, saying or creating types of user accounts that only certain people have access to certain information. You want to make sure you encrypt your data. And now you don't have to do every single piece of data has to be encrypted. But that is a good technique. In some cases it should be. Now do realize if you encrypt all your data, things are going to start going slower because you're going to have to decrypt it in order to read it. And so there's the loss of speed sufficient to overcome the greater protection. And then there's a variety of backup and recovery procedures that should be installed for protecting and making sure your data is ready and available for the business. And this also includes even physical security. So who has access to the data? Who can walk into the building where the database is stored? And so that's why I believe like Google has a data center here in North Carolina. The number of reporters that have been able to gain access to that data center is 0. They don't allow anybody who's not a current Google employee that has been approved to access this data center to actually walk into it and get in there and do anything. All right. Human safeguards. So we talked a lot about the technology and what we can do about that, but as we said, internal threats and human error can be a huge problem. Now, one thing that, and I don't know if they specifically talk about this, is something. If you don't understand the importance of the security threats and the ease of access people can get into it, you can inadvertently give up information that will allow computer criminals to do some serious damage. So some things, and these are more procedural things that can help safeguard your the threats, is to separate duties from authorities. So for example, someone who has the authority to approve an expense is not the person who writes the check. If you put it in the hands of the same person, that can lead to security problems. You also want to have, another possibility is what's called the least privilege, which is employees are given the least amount of privileges that would enable them to complete their job, but no more. Right? Now, sometimes this can be misjudged so that employees need more privileges than what they're granted to get the job done, which cause them to be frustrated because they can't do their job appropriately because they don't have enough privileges. So this is, it can be a double-edged sword, but it's still it's a security safeguard that you can build into it. And this even applies to information. You also want to have position sensitivity. So what is position sensitivity? Well, this is basically saying that you need to be very sensitive to positions, right? Now, well, let me think how best to describe this. You really need to, define what exactly is their role and within the organization. And as part of their position, they need to be trained in being sensitive with the data that they are given. So it's not so much about do they have access to data? Sure. Sometimes they are giving data, but once they are giving access to this data, they need to be not always just trained, but made aware of how sensitive particular data is. And awareness is the first step, but then also how to safeguard that data or resources is important. Okay, other procedures that can be accomplished could start from the hiring and screening process, making sure that you only hire reputable people who are not as likely to violate or to cause problems. You need to have policies on how you disseminate information. So once that data is there, who can share it, how can they share it, to whom? And this is true not only with your employees, but also with your customers and suppliers. And lastly, there should be policy set up for how do you deal with termination. I think I mentioned this earlier, especially with disgruntled employees or employees that are laid off. And this is why there's oftentimes a policy that when employees are fired or laid off, they'll come in the morning and the first thing that they'll do is be told, you've been fired, pack up your things and go home. And if they try to turn on their computer, their account will already be disabled because they don't want the occasional. And 99% of fired employees won't do anything. It's that 1% who are disgruntled and ticked off and feeling malicious that caused the problem. So having termination policies that can still protect your data is important. Other things, account administration. So, again, we're talking about user accounts, right? They need to have standards for new user accounts. How do you modify account permissions, removal of unneeded accounts, and so on. You need password management. For example, here at ECU, users are required to change their passwords every 90 days. You may not like that policy, but they do that on purpose, and in particular because at ECU, you have one password that's used for everything. And because of that, because you don't have multiple emails, you have one password for everything, they require you to change it regularly to help reduce the chances of problems. And then lastly, there needs to be a way of, and this can be actually a problem at some places because many organizations will have a help desk for their employees or even for their customers, right? So the customer might come in and say, hey, I am trying to access my account and I can't get into it. Can you please reset my password and send me the email at this email address? Well, the problem with that is, the help desk people want to be helpful. That's why they're at that job. But what you might do is inadvertently change a password or reset a password and give it to a computer criminal rather than to the legitimate person. So you have to authenticate the users in order to avoid this problem. And help desk management, and help desks were notoriously bad about this in the really early days of of computing systems and network support. So they've gotten a lot better about this, but you needed to still have policies about how to handle that. And that's why sometimes when you have to reset a password, you have to jump through hoops in order to prove you are who you say you are. And they do that not to piss you off, but to help to make sure that no one who's not authenticated gets access to your data. So, what should organizations do if there actually is an incident? Well, first off, they probably should have had a plan in place to begin with. Now, this doesn't always occur, and sometimes they get caught off guard. However, if there is an incident, what they should first do is try to centralize all the reporting of that incident. And be specific with responses. Do it quickly. If you are prepared, it certainly will help a lot. But don't try to make the problem worse. So, for example, recently there's been a number of cases of large companies that have had breaches in their data security. How do they deal with it? Well, the best thing for them to do is to announce that, yes, our security has been breached. Don't pretend that it hasn't been. Don't whitewash it. Be honest and say, someone has gained access to your information. We don't know necessarily what they've taken or what they're going to do with it, but here's what we can do for you to help solve this problem. And good organizations will actually practice how to deal with security incidents. So they can identify most of the major incidents that could happen, have a plan in place, even practice what to do. And this is particularly important when you come to things like disaster recovery. So if there is a disaster, and it doesn't have to be a disaster caused by computer criminals, this could be natural disasters too. What happens if there's a major flood that wipes out the building that you're in? Do you think there's disaster recoveries in place for businesses in New Orleans back when Katrina flooded the entire city? Well, if they did have disaster recovery and they practiced it and had it well set up, some of those businesses were not destroyed by that flood. They could have bounced back much quicker and with much less loss than those who didn't. Even though it was very tragic what happened there, the businesses that were prepared were able to come back and keep employing these people that live there. They were able to help grow the economy back so that people still want to keep coming back to New Orleans. All right, so that basically covers most of the discussion in the book. Again, I probably could have spent a lot more time on a lot of these issues, but I do want to real quick talk about some things that the book didn't cover, because it is absolutely essential for you to really have a grasp. And one is the legal environment and what's going on there, particularly when it comes to information and protecting intellectual property. Second, I want to talk about privacy a bit and what that means both in your organization and individually when you're purchasing things online. And lastly, briefly talk about identity theft. All right, so let's get into legal issues. Well, now, to really grasp what is involved with intellectual property, you have to understand what are rights, in particular what are property rights. So the idea behind rights is simply that you, as an individual, have a natural capacity, or not a capacity, in order for you to be to live successfully, need to have certain things protected universally. And one of those things is property, right? So in order for you to live, you need to have a right to your property. In other words, you have to be able to say, this is mine, and people can't just take it away from you. Because it makes it impossible for you to live if people can come along and willy-nilly take that away from you. Right? So that's essentially, and probably in a very loose terms, what a right, and I probably did a really bad job. You know, if you talk to a philosopher, they might be able to give you a much better definition of it. But essentially that's what it comes down to, right? It's a right is something that should be granted to you, and nobody can take that away from you. But it also doesn't contradict anything else that somebody else has. So you can't say, although, well, I shouldn't say, people do say this, I disagree with them, that I have a right to a job. Well, no, actually you don't, because if you have a right to a job, that means someone has to provide that job. So then they lose their rights. Well, that's not how rights work. One right shouldn't take away from somebody else's right. So for example, if you have an object, that doesn't take away the possibility of someone else having a different object, right? They can still keep objects. But what's yours is yours. And in order for us to live, in order to have a right to life, we need to be able to have property in order to live. We need to have house. We need to have clothing. We need to have food. Those are our properties. We need that in order to live. Right? So intellectual property is basically saying not just the physical creations, but the intellectual creations, the creations of our mind, also need to be protected. And through our history, we've actually identified several different types. In particular, what we're going to talk about are the three major ones that apply to information technology, which is inventions, literary and artistic works, and then symbols, images, names, and designs used in commerce. All right. So we're going to start with the second one. Literary and artistic works are protected by something called copyright. Again, the word right? So this is a grant given to an individual or a company from the government that allows the owner to reproduce a work in whole or in part and distribute it, perform, or display it in public in any form or manner that they want. So what does this mean? Well, and it used to be that copyright was something you had to specifically request from the government. Now they've changed the law such that if you create it and publish it, it is ipso facto considered copyrighted, although a very weak version of it. So if you put any type of writing on the internet, it is, by definition, copyrighted. What does that mean for you? Well, for example, you can't just go out and use any image on the internet any which way you want. You would be violating their copyright if you used a photograph that somebody else took. Even if they put that photograph on the internet, it is not available for you to use in any way you want. Okay, you could be violating their intellectual property. Right? They took the time and effort to create that image. If you want to use it, you have to ask them first. Can I use this? Right? That's it. And they can say no. And if they say no, then you can't use it. Right? Or they might say, yes, you can use it for $5 or for $10. And then you need to pay them before you use it. It also goes for words. So if somebody writes a blog post, you're like, well, it's a blog post. Why that's copyrighted? Yes, it's copyrighted. So anything published, and if it's available on the internet, it's considered published, right? It's a very loose definition of published. But if someone creates that type of content, it's by default copyrighted. And again, there's weak and strong forms of copyright, and I'm no lawyer, and I can but not tell you all the differences and how it works. I just know the basics that if it is published, it is considered copyrighted. All right. Second one, trademarks. Now this is the symbol or name of a company used by businesses to identify their goods and services. Could be their products, and could be the name of the company itself. But this you do have to register with the government in order to have a trademark before you have this legal right to use it. But it gives exclusive rights to use the trademark on goods and services registered to that sign. And they can take legal action against somebody else using a specific trademark. Now this also applies to names of companies. So for example, the company Nike, right? They have a trademark on the company name Nike, which means nobody else can use that. And this also applies to things like domain names, so www.nike.com. If another person or company reserved that domain name, Nike could claim a trademark violation and take legal action to take it away. Right? So trademarks do apply to things like domain names, but these are also still intellectual properties. So you can't use a trademark on your website without permission, because it essentially implies that they have approved of your site, which could be considered false, right? All right, and lastly is patents. Now, this is a whole complex issue. I'm not going to get into a whole lot of details. There is some development of patents of intellectual software. In fact, software itself is sometimes argued to be copyrighted, sometimes argued to be patented. Where it actually fits into this, I think the case law has not yet quite worked out. But you can think of software as a type of invention or process, right? But you can also think of software as it's some sort of written, published work. So where does it fit? Well, I don't know. But the fact of the matter is that patents are also intellectual property rights. They, again, have to be approved by the government to be granted a patent. It has to be unique. It has to be an invention that does some process or something. And it's only granted for a number of years. All right. So that's all I'm going to talk about in the legal environment. There is more issues in the legal environment, including laws such as HIPAA or FERPA, which is how do you protect certain types of information. HIPAA applied specifically for healthcare information. FERPA was designed for protecting, student information. So there are laws that are out there, but I don't want to get into all those details. If you get into those industries, you'll probably have to learn about them. I did want to move and talk a little bit about privacy. And now privacy is a very, I'll just say contentious, right? So here's a definition. I actually wrote an article on privacy, and the definition I came up for privacy is the desired state where selected information about one's activities and attributes is only observable by approved persons. Now, I threw a lot into this because, and when I started thinking about privacy, that's what I observed is it's a very complex subject, and it's very, people say, well, I want to protect my privacy. Well, what does that mean? Well, when I thought about it with my relationship with the people I live around, right? So, for example, I say I want my privacy, but it's not that I'm not willing to share information with everybody. It's only certain people I'm willing to share certain information with. So when I'm in the privacy of when I'm in my own home, I'm willing to share what I'm doing and things about me with the people in my home, but not with people outside of my home. And so I kind of delimit who has access to that information. But privacy is also a state, but it's also a value, something you value. That's why I have desired in there. Right? You desire to be in this place where only some information is observable. So it's a complex subject and one that I think is very difficult to talk about with a lot of people because everybody has different perspectives on what information could or should be shared and in what context. Right, so we're going to talk about two contexts here, and I really love to have really meaty discussions on this, and I wish we could. With an online class, it's much more difficult. But so hopefully I'll give you just a little taste of what the complexity and privacy can be in these two discussions. But consider this, though, right? So take an email that you send to somebody else. It could end up on 4 different places, right? So the sender's computer, it stores a copy of the email. Then the sender sends it to a server. So there's a sender's server. The email is going to be stored there. Then it goes to the recipient's server, and it's stored there. And then the recipient opens it on their personal computer, and it's stored there. So it's in 4 different places. And that's not even talking about all the different places where it traveled through. Probably isn't stored, but it traveled through to get there. So when you talk about privacy, when it comes to something like email, you have to keep in mind that, who now can have access to this email. So for example, if I'm using Gmail, which is made by Google, so I'm on my personal computer, I create an email and I send it to my wife, who has a Yahoo account. Well, that email is stored on Google's server, and it's also stored on Yahoo's server. Now, are they allowed to view that email? Well, when I say they, they're a whole company. So who in that company has access to that email? And what if there is a problem with their server and one of their administrators has to log into the system to fix it? And while they're in there, they see my email. Is that legitimate or not? So this is where things get much more hairy, because some people will assume that no, they shouldn't be able to, but it is on their server. That email is sitting on their server. So what do we do about it? Right? So that's where I think a lot of confusion comes from. Now, particularly when it comes to working in a company, oftentimes, like for ECU, if I send out an email from ECU, anybody, the IT administrators, manage the email server, right? And so they necessarily have some vested interest in what email is being sent in and out. And what we find is that a lot of companies do track the activities of their employees, their web traffic, their email, and sometimes it's not. And by tracking, what they mean is that there's not somebody sitting down and watching each employee and where they're all going. But usually they look for exceptions or some things that look odd. In fact, IT employees may have to track or be searching, those intrusion detection systems. Well, they might be looking to make sure that there's no zombie computers from the denial of service attacks, if you need to refer back to that. So the denial of service attacks, maybe one of the internal computers is a zombie computer. So they need to monitor the web traffic to make sure that that the employee is not, and the employee's computer is not causing a problem. However, businesses also have a vested interest in making sure that the resources they provide for their employees are being used appropriately, right? A company pays money to buy these computers. And so, yes, they do want to, make sure that the traffic that employees are going to are legitimate. In fact, 78% of employers report that there's been some sort of abuse where employees will sit. Maybe they'll sit all day and, shop online, not doing their job. In fact, 60% of employees admitted they've done some sort of abuse. But there's also sometimes a fine line between abuse and taking a small break from your day. So is it wrong to, at lunchtime, take 10 minutes to go out to Facebook? Well, what if it's 20 minutes? What about 25 minutes? How long is too much? How much is abuse? Is it a problem to do that? And so oftentimes this idea of this is my lunch break. I'm allowed to spend it doing something else. But companies will say, well, why don't you use a smartphone? So this is a complex issue, and that's what I kind of want to get this point across here. But when it comes to using the computer that's sitting on your desk at work, the company owns that. And if you're using it, you cannot expect to have privacy, right? Because They want to make sure you're not, visiting inappropriate sites, spending all day gaming, chatting, stock trading, or any type of misuse of the company resources. And so you might be monitored with things like keyloggers. That's not very often they do this, but they can do this, and they have every right to do this because it's their computers. Or hardware keyloggers, which are hardware devices that capture keystrokes moving between keyboard and motherboard. There can be screen capture programs. So keyloggers won't detect your mouse moving around, but a screen capture program will capture what's going on your screen. And then an email, well, again, it's stored on the company resources. So a lot of companies, in fact, 60% of employers monitor employee emails. Now, sometimes they're just looking for spam and trying to block spam, but they also want to make sure that no protected data is being sent out on that email. So yes, they're going to monitor that. They want to protect their business. And so should you. All right, what about privacy online? So how do websites gather information? Well, a big thing is self-registration. So you go out to a website and you register with a website. You give them information. So that can help with improving customer service or to sell. Now, they could also sell that to another company. You may not want them to, but they can because you've given it to them and now it's their information. But they also have to keep in mind that sometimes that information is inaccurate. So some people register for websites and put in false names or addresses or email addresses. So, websites do kind of gather this information, but they also can gather it from cookies, which track where you're at on their website. Now, there's actually even cookies that can track you going from different websites, and that's a little bit more complex how that's handled. But, for example, if I go out to look at a specific product on Amazon, sometimes I'll go to other websites, and then I'll see over in the, from an Amazon ad for that product again on a different website. So I know that using cookies, they can track your behavior going across different websites. And again, it's kind of complex how this happens, but the fact of the matter is they're gathering information about what you've done, what your interests are, your surfing patterns, and they try to create profiles that are more accurate than even self-registration, because self-registration, again, you can fake information. But, registration is very common. In fact, registration questionnaires, we find that 50% disclose personal information on a website for a chance to win a sweepstakes. If you got a chance to win something, yeah, sure, I'll give them my email. Well, it's not even sweepstakes, it's anything free. And to be honest, this isn't a bad thing. I've done it where I wrote basically consolidated a bunch of blog posts I had and made a little ebook. And I told people that, if you share your email address with me, I'll send you this ebook for free. Right? So it's a kind of a win-win. It was a neat little ebook about personal development. So a bunch of blog posts I had written about personal development, and I was sharing it with them for free, but they were giving me their email address. All right? So to me, it was a trade, right? So uses of private information, once it's been collected, so how can they do it? Well, it can be used for personalized direct marketing, maybe sold to third parties, maybe combined with cookie information. The idea, though, is what privacy can you expect? Well, the truth of the matter is when you share this information, that information now belongs to that company. And so you may or may not like that. Now, in Europe, they have a slightly different perspective on that, which is not only do you share that information with them, but you give them permission to do what they want with that information. So it's a little bit more complex in different countries and how that legal system works. But as consumers, You want to pull information from the organization without giving a whole lot of information to them. Companies, on the other hand, want to gain as much information on current and potential customers so they can better tailor their products, services, and messages to meet the needs of those customers. So while you may not want to give up the information, when they have it, companies can hopefully do something with it. So how do you make that connection between the lack of wanting to share and their desire to get the information? Well, it really comes down to an issue of trust, which is a major driver in sharing personal information and, well, actually for trade in general. So the overall takeaway here, let me stop that. Not the overall takeaway. One last subject area as far as online privacy is, especially online social networks like on Facebook, do be careful what information you place on these sites, particularly when you're looking for a job. But even before that, because this information, once it's out there, is out there, and you can't just delete an account and think it's going to go away, right? So you can delete the account, but the data is still there because it's on their servers. And some companies even buy archived profiles. Don't believe me? Go Google yourself. Google your name. Type in your name and Google yourself and see what comes up. And you might be amazed what you find. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about is beyond privacy is identity theft, which is the forging of someone's identity for the purpose of fraud. And it is still a major issue. In fact, a lot of people have reported problems with identity theft. And this does, in fact, impact a lot of people, especially your age group, 18 to 29. 29% of all people that have claimed identity theft are in that age group. So what does that mean? Well, basically what happens is somebody out there tries to take on your identity. Usually this is for things like purchases or credit card transactions. They'll pretend to be you by taking over your identity. Now, it could be something like you threw away a credit card statement or you just threw it in the trash. Well, somebody came along and picked it up, saw all your credit card information, your account number, your PIN number, maybe even a password you wrote down and threw in the trash can. Maybe they scanned a website and broke into a website, found your information, your credit card information or whatever. So then they pretend to be you and use your information to make purchases. Right? Do protect your information. Do make sure you go out and buy a shredder to shred your documents, particular financial data, your bank statements or credit card statements. Shred them. Don't give people the opportunity to get your information. Make sure you change your passwords occasionally. Make sure you don't share too much information out there for people to try to do this. And a good computer criminal could even develop the ability to steal your identity from viewing a Facebook profile. I mean, I've heard about stories of people being able to basically construct this, and it might take them several months of watching and looking at information about you, but they can figure stuff out. Maybe your patterns or your techniques or the behavioral modes or even special words you use. They can learn a lot about you and eventually over time basically mimic your identity and steal it. Not to scare you too much, but it is something you should be aware of. All right. Well, I think I've done enough talking for one day. So quick review, though. We talked about information system security, and the goal is, though, to protect against these vulnerabilities from these threats. It's a big, big problem and costs millions of dollars to lots of companies when these security problems happen. Should you respond, or how should you respond to security threats as an individual? Well, there's a lot of different ways that we talked about. But in particular, one big thing is just to be aware and to try to create ways of protecting from these vulnerabilities. Create safeguards. Same thing with an organization, particularly using a lot of policies and procedures, but also technological safeguards, data safeguards, but then the human safeguards as well. How should organizations respond to security incidents? Well, the biggest thing is be prepared. They will happen. That's not. I think history has shown that they will happen. The question is, how will you deal with it and deal with it effectively? All right. Well, I think that's where I'm going to stop for today, everyone. So do read through the chapter. There's a lot of information in there. But, try to see the big picture and how you can help make security important for you as an individual and for your organizations that you work for. And trust, you want to trust people, but only people that have earned it. And because there's always that one person out there who might be causing a problem that just, you want to trust them, but if you do, well, that's when things come crashing down. Well, that's it for today, guys.